Welcome to the adventures of Ceridwen, Episode 1, Ceridwen and the Giant's Mountain. It had been a long winter on Fern Gwen, the White Farm. Patches of snow could still be seen in places where the sun would not reach until spring arrived. The snowdrops had won the race to burst into flower just as they usually did. They might have been small and delicate, but snowdrops are also very enthusiastic and determined. And so snowdrops always just pip the crocuses to the post. As for the daffodils, they were waiting patiently underground for the air to get just a little bit warmer. Ceridwen was up and about, and even though it was very early and still dark in the valley, the winter sun would not appear over the mountain top for at least another hour. Ceridwen's mother Nesta was in the barn, and her father Edred stood outside, shuffling about to keep warm. It was lambing time, and the ewes were waiting for their baby lambs to be born. The farmer's children had been helping with the night watch, and when Ceridwen came to see how things were progressing, she overheard the children telling a story about a giant who used to sit on top of a high mountain. She couldn't believe it when she realized that the mountain they were talking about was the one she had been looking at the day before with her mother. She was just about to tell her mother this when Ceridwen realized that there was quite a commotion in the sheep pen at the far end of the barn. So even though she wasn't supposed to be there, she couldn't resist investigating what all the fuss was about. "She's had twins!" exclaimed Mrs. Owen the farmer. "We didn't see that coming. Maybe our luck has turned." "I'm not so sure about that," said Mr. Owen. "We had another letter from the bank yesterday. They are becoming impatient." Ceridwen hadn't got a clue what the Owenses were talking about. Besides, she was far too excited, because it was her mother who had just had twins. Of course, this meant that Nesta would have to fend for herself. Of course, this meant that Ceridwen would have to fend for herself for a while, at least a couple of months, while Nesta looked after the twins, while Edred would be mooching around in a field with the other rams. Ceridwen couldn't quite understand why rams did nothing to help bring up the baby lambs, left it all to the mother ewes. So with nothing better to do, Ceridwen decided it was time to investigate the story about the giant on the mountain. Because Ceridwen is a very curious sheep. If she heard about anything interesting, she always liked to find out more. So off she set. She made her way along a track she had discovered the day before. As she made her way along, she could see she wasn't the first to use that track. There were lots and lots of bundles of little round sheep droppings. This reassured Ceridwen that sheep could survive up mountains as well as in the valleys. But it was a long climb to the top, and the mountain always seemed just as far away. But as well as being curious, Ceridwen is a determined sheep as well. So on she plodded. Up and up she went, stopping every so often to build up her strength with a tuft of grass. The grass up the mountain was much tougher to chew and less sweet than the grass in the valley, but it would have to do. At last, Ceridwen reached the top of the mountain, where the snow still covered the ground. It was only then that she remembered that the days are much shorter in the winter. Oh dear, she said to herself, what will I do? This thought was so loud that it was heard by a big pair of ears. Hello, said Stella. Can I help? And there in front of the worried sheep was a mountain hare, still wearing the white coat she put on as a disguise in the snow. I came hoping to find out about the giant on the mountain, replied Ceridwen, but I hadn't realised how long it would take to get here, and there's no way I can get home tonight. How about you snuggle up with me, suggested Stella. We could keep each other warm, and I can tell you about the giant. Oh, thank you, said Ceridwen. That's very kind of you. It means I won't be lonely on top of this mountain. So off they went to where Stella had her bed made of dried bracken leaves. It was very, very cold, even colder than usual, because there were no clouds in the sky keeping any warm air in on top of the mountain. But this meant, because there were no clouds, it was a perfect night for stargazing. Oh, how I love the stars, sighed Stella. They shine so bright up here, away from all the lights where humans live. And so together, as they looked into the night sky, they could see a vast ocean of stars, some bigger and bright than others, and far, far too many to count. Stella gave Ceridwen time to adjust her eyes, before helping her to see how some of the stars formed a kind of picture, a shape, a bit like someone who was hunting. "That's Orion," said Stella. "Now, I may have told you I love looking at the stars, but looking at Orion always makes me feel a little sad and anxious, because Orion hunts hares like me." "Oh dear," said Ceridwen sympathetically. "Can you see those other two sets of stars close by Orion?" said Stella. Ceridwen nodded. "They are Orion's big dog and Orion's little dog. And look, they are chasing after Lepus, the hare." "Not all dogs are hunters," said Ceridwen. "The ones back home on the farm can be a nuisance at times, but that's only when Mrs. Owen sends them out to round us up." "One more thing," said Stella. "What's that?" asked Ceridwen. "The people round here have some lovely names for those 3 bright stars you can see where Orion's belt is. These are my favourites. Sometimes they call those 3 bright stars Llafn Fair, which means Mary's measuring stick. And come winter, they look up at those 3 same stars and say, 'Here come ye 3 Brennan. Here come the 3 kings.' And then, when Easter is getting near, they start to call them I Groes Fendigaid, which means the Blessed Cross. So as well as telling us stories from the Greeks, the stars can also help us to remember stories from the Bible." It had not been easy for Ceridwen to look up into the night sky. "Even though we have very good eyes," she explained, "it's not very easy for sheep to look up at the stars. Our eyes are focused downwards to help us to find grass and not to stumble when we're clambering over rocks and difficult places." "Still," said Ceridwen, "I really have enjoyed spending this night looking at the stars. And I know I will look at them more and more often. They're very beautiful, and I love the way they can help us to tell stories." It was then that Stella remembered her promise to tell Ceridwen the story about Idris the giant, who lived long, long ago. In fact, Idris lived so long ago, it was the time when stories were written not in books, but in people's memories. So Stella began to tell how Idris could sometimes be a little irritated. She told of one day when he got stones caught between his sandals and his big, hairy giant's feet. In a rather grumpy mood, Idris sat down on the rock at the top of the mountain, took off his sandals and hurled the stones down the mountain. And Stella said you can see those stones at the bottom of the mountain even today. They're like big boulders dotted around. That was on a bad day, said Stella. But mostly Idris was the kind of giant who dreams a lot, who imagines great things, who thinks deep thoughts, and who likes to sing. In other words, she explained, Idris was a poet, or as they are known in Wales, a bard. But I must warn you, said Stella, as she reached the end of her story. There is a rumour that those who sleep here on Idris's mountain, even for just one night, either go mad or, like Idris, they become a poet. Unfortunately, continued Stella, I turned a bit mad. Thankfully, it only affects me in the month of March. But it will be interesting, said Stella, to see what happens to you tonight. And with that, Stella gave a big yawn and nodded off to sleep. And while she slept, Ceridwen took one more look at the stars above. She thought about the long, long day it had been. She remembered the exciting news of the morning when the twins were born. She thought how well she had done to make her way up that mountain. And she remembered the kindness of her new friend. So as she looked at the stars, Ceridwen spoke to the sky. Thank you, she said. But now her eyes were very heavy. And before long, she too fell asleep. And it was while Ceridwen was asleep that she dreamt for the very first time. And her dream was a poem. Now I wonder, can you imagine how that poem went? So that's the end of the first episode, and I don't quite yet know how many other episodes are going to be, but there are a few in the making. But there's an invitation there at the end of that episode, I think, to you. If you want to take the invitation up, is to try and imagine what Ceridwen's first poem might have been about. Could be anything. It's often about the things we've been doing during the day before. They sort of all come together, and so she might have said something in her poem about the baby twins, or about the difficult climb, feeling a bit worried at times. Or the poem might have been about looking at those beautiful stars, or finding a new friend. all kinds of things. So, if you want to take the invitation to write a poem, then why not just do it? And I'd be very happy to see what poems you come up with, because who knows, they might just help me with part of the continuing story. Can't promise that, but ideas sometimes come to us in our dreams and when we write things down. So I encourage you to get a nice book, a lovely pen or pencil and a rubber, because we make mistakes. Maybe put your thinking cap on, because it takes a while to think. It doesn't all happen at once. And because it doesn't all happen at once, you need a bit of encouragement. So how about allowing yourself just a few tasty sweets, just to keep your energy up like Ceridwen needed to do, coming up this mountain. So next week we'll find out what happened next.